Imagine this: 50,000 men, armed, exhausted, deep inside hostile territory. Stop walking. The sun is going down. There are no walls, no fortress, no city, just open ground, tall grass, maybe a river nearby, maybe not. Around them, in every direction, an enemy that wants them dead. And these 50,000 men are about to do something that sounds absolutely insane. They are going to go to sleep, not huddled behind rocks, not hiding in caves. They are going to lie down in neat rows, close their eyes, and sleep so soundly that when the trumpets blow before dawn, they will wake up rested, fed, and ready to march another 30 kilometers with 40 kilograms of gear on their backs. And they will do this again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and the night after that, for months, for years, across entire continents. And almost nobody will ever successfully attack them while they do it. How? How is that even possible? The answer is one of the most underrated achievements in military history. A system so brilliantly engineered, so ruthlessly enforced, and so perfectly standardized that it turned the most vulnerable moment in any army's day into a strategic weapon. This is how Roman soldiers slept in enemy territory. And once you understand the system, you will never look at the Roman military the same way again. It started before the army even arrived. While the main column was still marching, thousands of legionaries trudging forward under the weight of their packs, javelins, shields, entrenching tools, and those heavy sharpened stakes we will get to shortly. A small specialized team had already ridden far ahead on horseback. These were the Mensores, the military surveyors, and their job was arguably one of the most important in the entire army. They were looking for tonight's campsite, and they were not just picking a nice flat spot. They were analyzing terrain, drainage, sight lines, proximity to water, defensibility, and the position of the enemy. Once they found the right ground, they went to work with measuring rods, stakes, and colored flags. By the time the first dusty legionary crested the hill and saw the site below, it was already marked out. Flags showed where the command tent would go. Stakes outlined the perimeter. Colored markers indicated which units' tents went where. The camp had been designed before a single spadeful of earth had been turned. And here is the part that made the whole system function at a level no other ancient army ever matched. The layout was identical every single night. It did not matter if the legion was in Gaul, in Syria, in the forests of Germania, or on the edge of the Scottish Highlands. The plan was the same. A rectangle. The Principia, the command tent, always sat at the center. The Via Principalis always ran east to west. The Via Praetoria always ran north to south. Every cohort, every century, every individual tent of 8 men had a fixed position relative to those two axes. Think about what that means for a soldier who has been marching for 10 hours, who is so tired he can barely see straight, who is carrying almost his own body weight in equipment, and who arrives at a campsite in fading light or total darkness. He does not need to ask anyone where he sleeps. He does not need a map. He does not need to stumble around searching. He walks through the gate, turns the direction he has turned every night for months or years, counts the rows, and finds his tent in the dark every time. That is not tradition. That is engineering applied to human exhaustion. And it is brilliant. But before anyone slept, the camp had to be built. And when I say built, I mean built. Every single legionary who was not on a specialized assignment, grabbed his entrenching tool and started digging. The perimeter ditch came first, roughly 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep, carved in a continuous rectangle around the entire site. The excavated earth was thrown inward to form a raised rampart. And then came the stakes. Every Roman soldier on the march carried 2 or 3 sharpened wooden stakes called pila muralia as part of his personal kit. He had hauled them all day long. Now he planted them along the top of that earthen rampart, points angled outward, creating an instant palisade. Behind the rampart, tents went up in their designated rows. Streets between the tent lines were left clear for rapid movement. Latrines were dug at the downwind corner of the camp. Cooking fires were lit only in designated areas. And all of this, the digging, the rampart, the stakes, the tents, the internal organization, was completed by a trained legion in under 3 hours. Some sources suggest closer to 2. An empty field became a fully fortified town with gates, streets, a command center, and defensive works that could resist a serious assault every single night, then torn down and rebuilt the next evening somewhere else entirely. The sheer logistical discipline this required is staggering, and it is one of the reasons Rome dominated the ancient world for as long as it did. Now let us talk about where these men actually laid their heads, because the Roman military tent is a piece of equipment that deserves far more attention than it gets. The Romans called it the papilio, the butterfly, probably because of the way the tent flaps looked when opened. And it was not made of canvas. It was made of leather, calfskin, specifically. Each tent required the hides of approximately 10 calves, carefully stitched together with waterproof seams, then treated with oil and tallow to resist rain. The result was heavy, around 40 kilograms per tent, but nearly indestructible under field conditions. Canvas rots, canvas mildews, canvas falls apart after weeks of sustained wet weather. Leather survives entire campaigning seasons of hard, brutal use. The Romans knew this and made the deliberate choice to accept the extra weight in exchange for long-term reliability. That is the kind of practical, unromantic, ruthlessly functional thinking that defined Roman military engineering at every level. Each tent housed 8 soldiers, not 7, not 10, 8. This was the contubernium, the fundamental atomic unit of the entire Roman military system. These 8 men did everything together. They marched together. They cooked together. They fought together. And every single night, they slept side by side in the same leather tent. This was not an accident of logistics. It was deliberate social engineering. When you sleep next to the same 7 men for months, when you share food and exhaustion and fear with them, when you know the sound of their breathing in the dark, you do not fight for Rome in the abstract. You fight for them. You fight for the man whose shoulder is pressed against yours in a tent that smells like sweat and leather and wood smoke. Unit cohesion in the Roman army was not built on the parade ground. It was built in the papilio, night after night after night. Inside the tent, organization was strict. Equipment was stacked at the entrance. Shields, spears, heavy kit, anything a soldier would need to grab in an emergency. This served 2 purposes simultaneously. First, it kept the sleeping area clear. 8 men in a leather tent do not have room for clutter. Second, and more importantly, it meant that if the camp was attacked at night, every man's weapons were immediately at hand, right there at the front of the tent, exactly where he would reach as he scrambled out. The rear section was the sleeping area. Straw mattresses when available, animal hides when not. sometimes just a cloak on bare ground. And there was one more factor that made these tents survivable even in the brutal winters of northern Europe. 8 human bodies in a sealed leather enclosure generate a remarkable amount of heat. Combined with wool tunics, heavy cloaks, and the windbreak provided by the rampart outside, Roman soldiers could survive nights that would have been genuinely dangerous in the open. We even have archaeological proof of this from Vindolanda, the Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall in Britain, where preserved letters show soldiers writing home to request extra wool socks and undergarments. They were cold, but they were managing, and they were still operational, which was all the system required. But the tent was only half the equation. The other half was the watch system. And this is where the Roman approach to sleep crosses the line from impressive into something approaching terrifying in its efficiency. The night was divided into 4 watches, called vigiliae, each lasting approximately 3 hours. Every soldier served 1 watch per night. That meant roughly 3 hours of guard duty and roughly 6 hours of potential sleep. Not 8, not luxurious, but enough. Enough to function, enough to march, enough to fight. The watch rotated through units systematically so that no single sentry bore a disproportionate burden. It was fair, it was predictable, and it was relentless. And the accountability system was ironclad. The officer of each watch received a small wooden tablet called a tessera, inscribed with the night's watchword. This tablet was physically passed from guard post to guard post throughout the night like a baton in a relay race. At the end of each watch, the tablets were collected and checked. If a tablet was missing, if the watchword was wrong, if the chain of custody was broken in any way, there was an immediate investigation. And if a guard was found to have fallen asleep on duty, this was not a disciplinary infraction. This was not extra latrine duty. This was a capital offense. The punishment was called fustuarium, and it is one of the most chilling enforcement mechanisms in military history. The condemned soldier was brought before his entire century, the 80 men whose lives his negligence had endangered, and they beat him with clubs and stones. Not the officers, his own comrades, the men who slept in the tents around him. The logic was brutal, but internally consistent. A sleeping guard endangered every single life in the camp, so the punishment was collective, carried out by the very men who had been put at risk. And Roman military records confirm that fustuarium was not merely a theoretical threat. It was carried out. Men died from it. The result was exactly what you would expect. Guards stayed awake. And because guards stayed awake, the camp slept. Not everyone slept the same way, of course. Senior officers, the legatus, the tribunes, the camp prefect, slept in the praetorium, the command area at the center of the camp. These were larger structures with separate compartments. The legatus had a private sleeping space. Documents, maps, campaign funds, and valuables were stored here under permanent guard. The praetorium was the one location in camp that was never fully dark. An oil lamp burned through the night, every night. Centurions occupied an intermediate position. Each centurion had his own small tent, slightly larger than standard issue, positioned at the end of his sentry's tent line. This placement was absolutely deliberate. The centurion could observe his men directly. He was close enough to hear anything: an argument, unauthorized noise, a disturbance. If his section of the perimeter failed at night, he answered for it personally. He had the authority to act on any nighttime disorder, and his vides, the vine stick that served as his badge of rank, was used freely and without hesitation on any soldier who required correction. The centurion did not just command his men during the day. He owned their nights as well. To truly appreciate what the Romans achieved, compare their system to what came after. Medieval European armies had no standard camp layout. There was no systematic overnight fortification. There was no organized watch rotation. Knights and nobles might have tents. Common soldiers, they slept on open ground wrapped in their cloaks, clustered around fires, with no perimeter defense worthy of the name. The camp, if you could even call it that, was guarded haphazardly at best. The consequences were entirely predictable. Medieval armies were regularly surprised in camp. Night attacks were not rare. They were a standard tactical tool, precisely because they worked so often. The sack of a sleeping medieval camp was not unusual. It was expected. It was practically a genre of medieval warfare. Roman camps, by contrast, were almost never successfully attacked at night. Think about the layers of defense an attacker faced. First, a 3-meter ditch and a rampart topped with sharpened stakes. Second, an organized watch with guards rotating through the night under a system where falling asleep meant death. Third, a standardized layout that meant every soldier in camp could orient himself and arm himself in total darkness within seconds. Fourth, collective punishment that ensured every man in the system had a personal, visceral stake in its enforcement. Even a relatively small Roman force inside a properly constructed marching camp could hold off a much larger enemy until dawn. Julius Caesar demonstrated this repeatedly during the Gallic Wars. His legions could construct a complete fortified camp faster than the Gauls could organize a response to attack it. By the time the enemy decided to strike, the ditch was dug, the stakes were planted, and the guards were posted. The camp was not a convenience. It was a tactical weapon, a mobile fortress rebuilt from nothing every single night, regardless of terrain, weather, or how close the enemy was. And every morning, it vanished. The trumpet sequence called the Classicum governed the entire process. First signal, rise and prepare. Second signal, strike tents and pack equipment. Third signal, fall in for the march. From the first trumpet blast to a fully formed marching column moving out took less than 2 hours. Tents were rolled and loaded onto pack mules, 1 mule per century. Latrine trenches were filled in. Cooking fires were doused. Those sharpened stakes were pulled from the rampart, strapped back onto soldiers' packs, and carried to the next campsite where they would be planted again that evening. The perimeter ditch was the only thing left behind. Filling it would take too long and serve no purpose. But everything above ground was removed. A fortified town that had housed thousands of men, complete with streets, gates, a command center, and defensive works, was reduced to an empty field with a rectangular scar in the earth in under 2 hours. And that night, 30 kilometers away, the whole thing was built again from scratch. This is what made Rome different. Not just the legions, not just the gladius or the pilum or the testudo. The system, the relentless, unsexy, grinding system that took every single aspect of a soldier's existence, including the hours when he was unconscious and utterly vulnerable, and engineered it for maximum military effectiveness. The Roman approach to sleep was not about comfort. No soldier sleeping on a straw mat in a leather tent shared with 7 other men would call it comfortable. It was about control. Control of the perimeter. Control of the layout. Control of the watch. Control of the morning departure. Every element, tent assignment, ditch dimensions, trumpet timing, watchword protocols, punishment for failure, was designed to extract the maximum possible rest from a fighting force that needed to sustain operations for months, sometimes years at a time. A soldier behind that rampart slept knowing he was watched over by guards whose own survival depended on staying alert. He slept knowing he could leave his sleeping position, grab his shield and gladius from the tent entrance, and be armed and oriented in the dark within seconds if the alarm sounded. He slept knowing the system worked because it had worked last night, and the night before, and every night for the last 6 months of the campaign. And that security, that engineered, enforced, systematic security, translated directly into combat power. Rested soldiers march further. Rested soldiers fight harder. Rested soldiers make better decisions under the crushing pressure of ancient battle. Every night of protected sleep was an investment in the next day's fighting capacity, compounding over weeks and months until the cumulative advantage became overwhelming. The Roman army campaigned across 3 continents, from the rain-lashed hills of Scotland to the burning deserts of Mesopotamia, from the frozen banks of the Rhine to the shores of North Africa. And every single night, wherever they were, whatever the terrain, whatever the weather, whatever the threat, they built their camp, posted their guards, laid down in their leather tents, and slept, not because they were safe, because they had engineered safety out of discipline, dirt, and sharpened wood. That is not just military history. That is one of the greatest organizational achievements the ancient world ever produced. And it happened every night, in silence, in the dark, while the rest of the world slept without knowing how.